Welcome to the third lecture of our Global Agenda series, which we entitled it Global Demands, Regional Responses. My name is Julio Carrion, and I'm the director of the Center for Global and Area Studies at our university. And it is truly my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Danya Greenfield is the acting director of the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East, a center that was created on the wake, or pretty much around the same time that the Arab Spring was taking place. And so it's quite apropos that she is with us tonight. The Atlantic Council, for those of you who are not familiar with the organization, was founded in 1961, and I quote from their website, "It's a center devoted to promote constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the central role of the Atlantic community in meeting global challenges," end of quote. Located in Washington, D.C., the Atlantic Council is a wonderful forum that houses experts and policy makers who exchange views about, dare to say, global demands and regional responses. The Council houses 10 different centers, and we have the privilege tonight to have with us Danya, who is the acting director of the Center devoted to the Middle East. Before joining the Atlantic Council, Danya was a program officer for the Middle East and North Africa at the Center for International Private Enterprise, and before that, she was a program officer at the International Republican Institute. She is a graduate of the Johns Hopkins Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies, commonly known as SAIS. It is truly an honor to have her tonight, somebody who is such an expert on the region, and to talk to us about such an important topic. She's basically going to talk to us about the democratization process in the Middle East and the challenges that this process faces today. Before I cede the podium to her, I want to remind you that 2 weeks from now, on a Tuesday rather than a Wednesday, on March 25th at 7:30, we have scheduled to be part of our series Sir Peter Westmacott, the British ambassador to the U.S., and I hope that you will find the time to come to enjoy his talk. Without further ado, let's please give a warm welcome to Danya Greenfield. You want your water?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Julio, for inviting me into the university, for hosting me. It's been really a pleasure to be here with your class this afternoon and for dinner having an informal chat with your students. I really enjoyed hearing their interests and their concerns. I like the title of this topic, Arab Spring and Beyond, because it really is about looking beyond a particular season. And we've started to shy away from using the term Arab Spring because it makes it seem as though in 3 or 4 months' time we're going to have completed this whole process, wipe our hands clean, close up shop, and that's it. And it really is a very long-term process of transition underway. So the term Arab Spring or Arab Awakening or the Arab Uprisings generally refers to the wave of unrest and popular protests that first emerged in Tunisia in December 2010 and then spread across the region in 2011 to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, as well as Jordan, Morocco, Oman, and even Saudi Arabia. It started, as maybe some of you remember, with the self-emulation of a street vendor in a rural town in Tunisia whose cart was confiscated, and then he was publicly humiliated and no longer willing to tolerate this kind of injustice. His singular actions sparked sympathy among thousands of Tunisians who echoed his desire for political and economic opportunity. and poured into the streets of Tunis demanding change and an end to a corrupt regime that had benefited a small elite at the expense of the masses. The waves of street demonstrations throughout the region culminated in the overthrow of leaders in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen, whereas in Syria, a peaceful protest movement metastasized into what is now a bloody and violent conflict, civil war, that has ravaged the country and claimed already 120,000 lives. And in Bahrain, periodic demonstrations against the ruling family continue to this day, whereas in other monarchies, the leaders either claim gradual managed reform, as in Jordan and Morocco, or have suppressed dissent entirely. While each one of these cases could be the subject of an entire course, of a semester-long course, I'll try and focus my remarks actually on 4 cases in particular, and to speak a little bit about the underlying factors that led to this wave of change and this wave of dissent. And these 4 countries are ones that really witnessed profound political upheaval and a change in political leadership: Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen, where millions of protesters successfully forced from power autocratic leaders who had governed for decades. And they did this through a combination of peaceful protest, violent rebellion, and negotiated departure. If you've been following these cases and these stories in the news over the past several years, you've probably witnessed first intense euphoria and then deep disappointment. What we have realized since then is that removing a singular leader, even a strongman dictator, is just the tip of the iceberg and marks only the beginning of a long journey to rebuild countries that were plagued by decades of mismanagement, corruption, and abuse. In some cases, the deep state has reasserted itself, as in Egypt, and in other cases, the weakness of state institutions has actually thwarted progress, as in Yemen and Tunisia and Libya. As each country represents its own unique characteristics and conditions, there are still some common elements or themes that one can draw from this. Those who came out into the streets rallied for a better life, for responsive government, equitable economic growth, and most importantly, social justice. As new political forces have come to the fore, we've realized that the struggle is more complicated than we may have thought initially. It's not really about a singular autocratic leader, but rather against changing fundamental political structures and systems, and those who benefited from the former regimes, including military, political, and economic elites, who still seek to preserve their interests and their economic largesse. Yet it's important to note that in fact some concrete, some positive change has occurred. The wall of fear has been irrevocably broken, and the willingness of thousands of average citizens to overcome their fear and risk injury, torture, and even death to press their governments for change was and still is an inspiration. Before getting to these 4 specific case studies, I wanted to explore a little bit again about these underlying themes or factors that led to the wave of change. And I would highlight perhaps five key themes. The first is a quest for dignity. While there are many social, economic, and political factors that led to these waves of uprisings and demonstrations, the essential component can be distilled down to one word, and that is dignity. The quest for human dignity is a common underlying factor that linked what happened in Sidi Bou Said in Tunisia to what happened in the streets of Taz in Sana'a in Yemen. This is not an abstract concept, but rather the culmination of decades of repression as a result of police brutality, nepotism, and the lack of freedom of speech. Those in the streets were not shouting slogans for representational electoral democracy, but rather rejecting the humiliation that came from the systematic abuse of power and corruption that manifested itself in the political, economic, and security dimensions of everyday life. The second key factor is economic despair. There's been a great deal of debate of how much of this was due to political factors, how much due to economic factors. But I think there's no argument that, in fact, economic considerations played a huge role. And what will happen in the future, we cannot understand without integrating an analysis of the economic pressures. In the decade prior to the uprisings, while macroeconomic indicators appeared relatively positive And in fact, Egypt was noted by the World Bank as one of the best performers in 2010. The daily living conditions for the mass majority were actually declining. The cost of living was rising, jobs were harder to find, housing more difficult and more expensive. The momentum and impetus for this movement of change emerged because of the convergence of economic and political factors. The need to feed one's family was coupled with the demand to choose one's own leaders. The need for a job was coupled with intolerance for corruption and misuse of power. Bread and butter issues were and still are powerful motivations, and spiraling unemployment, rising food prices, and low wages played a major role. The third key factor is the breakdown of the social contract. With varying degrees of success, the authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East and North Africa had established a social contract with citizens. Essentially, the bargain was political acquiescence and silence on the part of the people in exchange for government provision of health care, education, a decent job, and access to basic services. But what happened is, over the past 20 years, was the slow degradation in the quality of these services and an increasing demand on the government to provide public sector jobs. This was felt in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, and is even a concern in much wealthier countries such as Saudi Arabia. Some classes at Cairo University were filled with nearly 2,000 students in a hall meant for 500, where hospitals and clinics lacked essential equipment and medicine, and the good paying in jobs and scholarships went to those who had wasta, or influence as it's known in Arabic. With the government unable to fulfill these commitments, the willingness of the people to turn a blind eye to its abuses and failings was no longer something to be taken for granted. The fourth factor is a demographic explosion, and the demographic changes in these countries had a monumental impact and placed enormous pressures on the government. The Middle East and North Africa region has the largest proportion of the population under the age of 35 when compared with the rest of the world. And more than 30% of Egypt's population is under the age of 30. Unemployment among youth ranges from 20 to 40% in various countries throughout the region. Young people with university degrees expected a decent paying job upon graduation, as I'm sure many of you here would expect as well. And yet thousands of graduates from Marrakesh to Sana'a found themselves with no job, ill-prepared for the global market, and bleak options for their future. The youth bulge also placed pressure on the housing market, transportation, infrastructure, and other needs of the population that couldn't be served by the government. And the last is social media, which has received a lot of attention. And I would note that while social media played a significant role, there's a tendency perhaps to oversubscribe or overemphasize its importance. It was a facilitating tool, I would note, and not a cause. Without Facebook and Twitter, it would have been far more difficult for activists to organize mass protests and communicate about where people were meeting and what they should do. Social media facilitated coordination, but it did not engender the frustration, anger, and despair that ultimately drove people into the streets. At the same time, the rapid rise in internet and satellite television meant that young people in Arab countries could and did see their circumstances through a global comparative lens. And this encouraged them to feel that they deserved a better life, more responsive government, and less corruption. So with these sort of underlying factors turning to the four countries in question, where do things stand now? It makes sense to start with Tunisia, since this is where it all began, and it's also the place where a genuine democratic transition is the most likely to succeed. The protest that started in December 2010 ended with President Ben Ali fleeing the country. A transitional government was soon put in place, and the Tunisians adopted a process that elected a constituent assembly that was tasked with writing a new constitution. Ennahda, the primary Islamist party that's affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, was banned during Ben Ali's regime and then subsequently won the largest number of seats in these elections. They formed a government with two other non-Islamist parties, demonstrating a willingness to build consensus for the sake of the country, and they made important compromises regarding the role of Sharia law in drafting the constitution. But heightened polarization and the assassination of two prominent secular leaders last year caused a complete stalemate in the process for months. And with the country teetering on the brink of political collapse, there was a series of painful, intense negotiations, and ultimately the primary political factions were able to forge a compromise that led to the resignation of the Ennahda-led government, the completion of the constitution, and a commitment to new elections. This was a pivotal moment in Tunisia's history, as well as for the rest of the region, because it demonstrated that compromise did not mean failure, and that politics did not need to be seen as a zero-sum game. Tunisia's major challenge at this point are negotiating the still present tensions between religion and state, addressing the rise of Salafi groups, reinvigorating the economy, and bridging the wide gap between the coastal region that's more affluent and the interior. Unemployment has actually risen since the uprising started and has reached nearly 20%. And Tunisia's success will depend on its ability to generate enough new jobs to satisfy the youth population. Security is still an issue, and border concerns and extremist groups have found safe haven that creates concern for the new government. Yet Tunisia is blessed with many factors that will also aid in its transition. It has a relatively small population, a tradition of secularism and links with Europe, high levels of literacy, and a strong record of women's inclusion and participation. So I would say its trajectory looks relatively positive. Although Tunisia was the first, the success or failure of the Arab awakening will largely rest on what happens in Egypt, as the largest and arguably most important country in the region. Hosni Mubarak's departure came at the culmination of a mass movement demonstrating in Tahrir Square for 18 days nonstop that brought millions of people together, young and old, men and women, secular and religious, rural and urban. And this public pressure prompted the military establishment not to stand behind and beside Mubarak. It's a complicated and involved story about what transpired next, but the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, essentially the military aspect, assumed executive authority, attempted to preserve its own authorities and privileges, established a transitional government, and led the way for presidential and parliamentary elections in 2012 and 13. These elections were hotly contested, but largely considered relatively free and fair, and resulted in stunning victory for Islamist parties. The Freedom and Justice Party, affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, took 40% of the seats, and the Salafist An-Noor Party gained a surprising 25%. And the Brotherhood candidate, Mohamed Morsi, won the presidential election in a runoff round. The Muslim Brotherhood had been an underground organization for most of its existence since the 1920s, had finally reached the most important positions of power. This was a pivotal moment in Egypt's history, and how they proceeded and how they fell from grace will portend what happens in Egypt's future. Although the Brotherhood had initially taken great pains to assure both Egyptians and the international community that, in fact, it would not seek to grab all reins of power, that pledge quickly unraveled. The Brotherhood-dominated parliament appointed a 100-person constituent assembly to draft the constitution, which effectively marginalized liberals, Christians, and women, and rammed through the final draft in a public referendum. At the same time, President Morsi systematically accumulated power by challenging the judiciary, marginalizing civil society, and threatening the rights of minority groups. This single-minded focus on accumulating power and marginalizing his opponents, not attending to the economic needs of the population, led to a second wave of mass demonstrations this past summer that culminated in a military-led coup on July 3rd and the overthrow of President Morsi and his government. What has happened since then has been the systematic suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood and the killing of more than 1,000 protesters and Brotherhood supporters, a clampdown on freedom of expression, and the arrest and persecution of dozens, if not hundreds, of human rights activists and journalists. This has been the single most disappointing and devastating outcome of the Arab awakening, and the climate of suppression has not yet concluded. While the military-led government has sizable public support for its actions in the name of combating terrorism and guaranteeing the security of the country, There are small pockets that continue to speak out against these abuses. The challenges facing Libya are in a different category altogether. The country that Muammar Gaddafi left behind and that endured nearly 10 months of brutal civil war must rebuild itself nearly from scratch. Despite the amount of oil wealth in the country, the level of infrastructure is abysmal. Illiteracy is high, education systems and curricula need to be revamped, and basic institutions are nearly absent. Unlike Tunisia and Egypt, where political parties were weak and the parliament was merely a rubber-stamping authority, Libya lacked even the most rudimentary of these structures and is just starting to build a culture of political participation. Whatever unity had emerged around the goals of the revolution dissipated quickly in the following months, and the infighting among rival militias and the government has stemmed progress. A self-appointed body held elections for a constituent assembly, the General National Congress, but the body has been plagued by a lack of clarity about its mandate, weak political parties, factional infighting, and a complete absence of real leadership. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister lost a vote of confidence in the General National Congress, and there are real questions about what happens next. The central challenge for Libya is to deal with the thousands of militias roaming the country who fought against Gaddafi and take pride in being revolutionaries. They refuse to hand over their weapons, and there is yet to be a political solution to bring them on board. Without some semblance of baseline of security, it will be nearly impossible to start investing in infrastructure and tap into the vast oil resources that Libya does in fact have. They've elected recently a 60-person constitution drafting committee, but voter turnout was low and some minority groups boycotted the election altogether. Somehow the country needs to come around this constitution process, a genuine inclusive national dialogue, and ultimately new elections to put in place a parliament and a president that has credibility. How Libya will manage to do this remains to be seen, and support from the international community will be critical to get to the next stage. Yemen, which is a country I have a particular interest in, presents another model entirely. After months of youth demonstrations, inspired in part by the example of Tunisia and Egypt, and fierce fighting between supporters of the former president and his rival, the international community pressured former President Saleh to sign a deal that ushered his departure and brought in his deputy to assume control. This is notable because it's the only example of these countries of a negotiated transfer of power in the region. The positive side is that it avoided a bloodbath and civil war, as we are now seeing in Syria. But the downside is that the deal did not resolve any of the underlying issues. Saleh and his family continue to wield political power behind the scenes, and military confrontations erupt daily as the government tries to fight both rebels in the north and separatists in the south. Yemen, on a positive note, just completed an inclusive, multi-stakeholder national dialogue that took 10 months and resulted in nearly 1,400 recommendations on issues ranging from the status of the south of the country, transitional justice, and economic development. What is most important about that effort is that it included political actors that had previously been excluded, and it was truly an inclusive process. Yemen's President Hadi, the transitional president, has a lot of credibility, unlike his counterpart in Libya, but he too has an ineffective government, and he's fighting an al-Qaeda-affiliated insurgency in the south of the country. He also confronts a massive humanitarian problem, as Yemen is the poorest country in the region on the level of sub-Saharan Africa. The outlook is pretty dismal, but Yemen has managed to survive through countless predictions of collapse. And what gives me hope for Yemen is actually the commitment and passion of youth activists, new political actors, and civil society groups that may be able to chart a course forward. So in looking at these four countries and where they've come over the past 3 years, there are a couple trends that seem salient throughout. The first is that former regime stalwarts are reasserting themselves and trying to reassert control. In Egypt, the military takeover and the prospective election, presidential election of General el-Sisi is a prime example. In Yemen, the former president has relinquished his position, but continues to maintain his titular head of the General People's Congress Party, and is in fact thwarting any genuine political change from behind the scenes. Remnants of the disbanded ruling party in Tunisia have also resurfaced, and while they are liberal in a certain sense, they also represent the old corrupt elite. The second and perhaps most important outcome is the unclear trajectory for political Islam. The rapid rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt marked a profound shift for the region, and the removal of President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood-led government has had an equally chilling effect. In some countries, Islamist parties had been already participating in elections and had served in government, but never before had an Islamist movement led a country, and then failed so miserably. The public protests that emerged last summer in Egypt were motivated not only by a deep distrust of the Brotherhood, but also because of their colossal failure to effectively govern the country and improve the economy. In Tunisia, on the other hand, the Islamist Ennahda party demonstrated a willingness to work in coalition, but also has been critiqued for its poor performance. How they fare in elections this coming year will say a great deal about the ability of Islamist parties to be an effective political force. And at the same time, the fall from grace of Egypt's brotherhood and the potential radicalization as they are pushed underground will have massive implications for how these countries are able to accommodate and incorporate Islamist movements into formal politics. Lastly, success will rise and fall based on the economy and the economic performance. The success of these transitions will be determined by how well the new and future elected governments are able to deliver. Egypt is facing a serious economic crisis, and despite the massive influx of funds from the Gulf countries, this may not be enough. For both Egypt and Tunisia, tourism was a major source of revenue and has tanked in both countries over the past several years, in addition to the decline in foreign and domestic investment. Libya is struggling to return oil production to pre-war levels and will need to invest in rebuilding its entire infrastructure damaged by years of neglect and fighting. Without some improvement in the daily lives of ordinary people, the new governments will lose popular support and will not be able to sustain their legitimacy. Now entering the fourth year of these transitions, how would we assess progress? It seems pretty dim, but I think the essential component here is to take a long-term view on how these countries will evolve and change over time. On the political front, the track record is indeed mixed. The return of a military-backed government in Egypt, tenuous compromise amidst political polarization in Tunisia, security crises that prevent basic state function in Libya, and fear that tribal power struggles and former regime loyalists will thwart progress in Yemen leaves a pretty dim view. At the same time, though, it's important to note that there have been significant political gains when compared with where things were in 2010. Despite months of political impasse in Tunisia, the country's Constituent Assembly passed one of the Arab world's most progressive constitutions this January. And in Yemen, as I noted, its national dialogue completed an inclusive 10-month process that brought in key stakeholder groups to articulate their demands and needs. Perhaps most importantly, though, the revolutions have ushered in a space for participatory politics, public accountability, and greater freedom of speech and assembly. And though elements of the old state and security apparatus are working to preserve their power, the public is mobilized and will not tolerate authoritarian governance indefinitely. Each country will chart its own course, but they are clear on what they do not want and what they will no longer accept. A government that impinges on people's dignity and violates fundamental human rights. Despite the setbacks, there are still opportunities for positive steps forward for reform. And I would say reform, not necessarily democratization. Perhaps most importantly, the revolutions broke the barrier of silence that often stifled dissent with self-censorship. Calls for change will not dissipate until the original demands of the revolutions are met, and this pressure will continue to grow and push governments to adopt a new approach to provide greater economic and political opportunity. This will be a gradual and often frustrating process. I imagine 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, but it is the only viable alternative for a long-term sustainable future for the Arab world. Thank you.
Thank you, Danya. That was a very good overview of the process of reform or democratization in these 4 important countries. And I just want to start the conversation with a couple of questions that I have. And the first one, of course, relates to political Islam, which is a significant political factor in the Middle East. And it's difficult to imagine a future of democracy that does not include in one way or another political Islam, in the case of Egypt, the Islamic Brotherhood. And let me just preface very briefly my question by referring to Venezuela, which is called in Latin America the Saudi Arabia of Latin America. In the late 40s, a party called Democratic Action won elections massively. And they ruled for 3 years, but during those 3 years, they used their electoral support and their control of the institutions to really try to install a very oppressive and not quite democratic government. And they were overthrown by a military government. But 10 years later, the Democratic Action learned from that experience and realized that they could not just monopolize political power in Venezuela, even though they were the majority party, and they reached a consensus with other parties that brought some decades of democratic rule in Venezuela until the 2000s when Chavez came and unraveled all that. So my question is, what is happening with the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt? Is there any indication that some people are thinking about the experience of what they had and how the coup came about? Is there and I know that you're talking about that we are thinking long term. This is not going to happen in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but is there a possibility of some kind of change in the Islamic Brotherhood and embracement of some form of democratic form of government that provides a foundation for democracy in Egypt?
It's an excellent question, and I would answer it in 2 ways. I think the first is that the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt actually taught a lesson to a lot of groups elsewhere in the region, not necessarily yet inside Egypt. But the fact that the Islamist party in Tunisia, Ennahda, was so willing to compromise, and at this pivotal point of political impasse this past year, one of the reasons why they were more accommodating was in fact because they saw what happened to the Brotherhood in Egypt and learned their lesson from that. And I think as well in Yemen, one of the largest political parties is also a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated party, the Islah Party. And I think they're also taking note of the mistakes made and this desire to centralize power as they chart their own course within their electoral strategy and how they're trying to participate in governance in Yemen and in Tunisia. So on one hand, I think it's having an effect elsewhere in the region as people are taking note and learning that lesson. In terms of what happens in Egypt, at this point, the Brotherhood is vying for its very survival. They are under attack from every direction. Their leadership are either in jail or outside the country or have been killed. And so at this point, I don't think there's a lot of reflection and soul searching going on about, well, if we were to come to power again, how would we do it differently? They're in a state of mere survival. And I certainly would hope that the current transitional government and the government that comes into power with new elections in the coming year would reverse this trend and bring the Brotherhood back into the political process, because what is underway right now is extremely dangerous, not only for the repressive tactics that the government is employing, but perhaps more importantly, the likely scenario of further radicalization of the Brotherhood as they get pushed underground in an effort to thwart any progress in the country and sort of reassert itself. So my hope is that they would have some of that internal soul searching, but I think it will take quite some time before that happens when they are sort of repatriated as political actors in the country.
Right, okay. I'm sure there will be more questions from the audience regarding this issue. The second question that I have is going to change the topic a little bit, and it's something that I'm sure also will generate some conversation, and is what the United States can do to help, if not strengthen, the changes that are happening in the Middle East. And I'm talking about in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't think it's productive at this point to talk about the policy of the last 15 or 20 years. But what is your assessment of the U.S. stance towards the Arab awakening, and is there something that can be done that is not being done today, something that might actually help the process?
I think the United States and Europe, for that matter, have largely fallen short in terms of being able to provide a really robust response about how to help these countries. And I say that mostly if you compare the discourse and the rhetoric right after the Arab uprising started. President Obama gave a very stirring and compelling speech in May of 2011. And if you compare that with what we've actually delivered and what we've actually done, it's pretty distressing. There's very little that we've been actually able to deliver to these countries in the way of financial and economic assistance. And in terms of sort of robust political and diplomatic support, there also have been many moments where we have maybe been more passive than we should have been, quiet, and in areas where we should have taken a greater stance. And I would also compare what the administration was saying back then in May of 2011 with President Obama's speech at the UN General Assembly in September of this year that hardly mentioned at all support for the Arab transition. So from going from a place where the call was to leverage all mechanisms and all branches of government, all sources of assistance to help these nascent transitions succeed, to a place where during the UN General Assembly speech, the 3 priorities mentioned are Iran, mitigating disaster from Syria, and Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, all 3 of which are very important objectives, none of which have anything to do with political and democratic change in the Arab world. And so I think that it really has fallen off the radar. It's fallen in the hierarchy of priorities, and I don't think that we have really fulfilled the promises that we made. And there were really a lot of heightened expectations among people in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere who heard this. Specific amounts of money were even mentioned that haven't yet been delivered. And so I think there's been great disappointment on the part of young people, especially rallying for this kind of change, thinking that the United States will support our aspirations in this quest, and we have not been as forthcoming as I think we could have. What we do from here on out is another very difficult question, and I think in that case it really is a country-by-country approach that needs to be taken. What we need to do in Yemen is completely different from what we need to do in Tunisia, which is completely different from what we need to do in Egypt. And in some cases we have somewhat of a strategy, and in other cases we really don't. And I think the lack of a strategy of how to actually help these transitions succeed is what's most notable.
And why do you think it is that we haven't really delivered on the early promises? I mean, it's just another example of the dysfunction in Washington, or is that there are other more pressing international issues, a combination of that, some additional factor, or maybe the realization that there is very little that can be done?
All of the above. I think it's actually a combination of the fact that these transitions have been far more difficult than we expected. I think when these changes started, there was this euphoria and this feeling of, it's the wave of change in 1989. It's there are all these comparisons made with other democratic transitions in a sense that things would go smoothly and quickly. And as they hit roadblocks and as the path was increasingly bumpy, there was a feeling of pulling back, I think, on the part of the Americans. That combined with the lack of financial resources as a result of global financial decline overall, combined with a lack of congressional interest in foreign policy matters writ large, combined with a sense of we have very little leverage and ability to actually influence and help shape what happens. The sense of declining American power in the region, in the world in particular, really led to a sense of there's really not much that we can do, so why should we expend the resources? And in some cases, not necessarily finding or seeing a counterpart on the other side that wanted the assistance or wanted what we were offering. So I think a combination of all of these things together has really led the response to be far more lackluster, I think, than we would have hoped.
Okay, so we're going to now open up the conversation. So let me start with the student, and then we'll be a little bit more. Yeah, Dana.
So you mentioned that for some of these regimes, they were naturally stronger than other ones that were much weaker. Why do you think that a lot of these countries are having, like some countries are having an easier time instating a democracy while the other ones are having a more difficult time? Do you think it is because of the previous regimes that were there, or do you think there's kind of like cultural differences that are making it difficult in some of these countries, like Egypt, where they're being successful democracies? What is the difference between these type of countries that makes it like that?
So I'm going to try to summarize because we're recording and there is no mic there. So the question is, why have countries have been more successful in enacting these political changes than others?
I think in large part it is a combination both of the political structure that was in place, the cultural environment, the level of education, the population size, the economic factors. It's really a combination of all of those. And I think the most obvious example is Tunisia versus Egypt. Tunisia has a fairly homogenous population. It's very highly educated. Women have always had a prominent role participating in public life. Lots of linkages with Europe and with France in particular, and a sense that there is something that they're aspiring to that is within grasp. And I think these various factors have allowed the Tunisians to move forward in a way that has been far more difficult for Egypt. Yemen has its own set of characteristics, but it actually would take about 3 hours to describe why Yemen is so complicated. But it has, but it has, it has tribal factions, it has a growing insurgency, and it has a devastatingly poor country. And so the combination of those has thwarted the ability to sort of forge a central vision about how to move forward. And there are a lot of elements that are trying to actually undermine the process, which is a situation that I don't think you have in Tunisia. So the homogeneity of the population, I think, actually lends a great deal to why they've been able to manage their success better, and also this ability to compromise and to build consensus, that was sort of a pre-existing element of their kind of political environment.
There were a few questions. Yes, sir. So the question is the role of women in this process of political change in the Middle East. Is it because it's not there, or we just don't really pay much attention to it?
We were actually having this conversation in the reception before about what role have women played. And I think it's interesting because in each of these places, actually, women played a fairly prominent role in the activist movement and the street demonstrations. They were out in Tahrir Square. They were helping to organize. And yet what we've seen over the past, 2+ years since then is actually a bit of rolling back. So it's almost as though they claimed additional space. They gained a lot of credibility, I think, among their colleagues and their cohorts. And as the political space both opened and then has subsequently shut, women have been kind of marginalized once again. And in fact, what's most disturbing is that this sort of rise in violence against women, in using rape as a tactic, the sort of virginity tests in prisons where women were being detained in Egypt. I mean, you hear these stories that are really quite disturbing. So I would like to say that women sort of took the forefront of these and were rewarded and included in these political movements subsequently. But I think what we've seen actually is a sort of return to that marginalization. Although I would say with notable exception is Tunisia, because this was sort of already a fairly strong part of their own cultural political system, and they have maintained that. That was a fight that they had to fight in drafting the constitution, and they've implemented a quota system. And I would say in Yemen, there's also been some positive indications early on in the national dialogue process brought out these recommendations. One of them is a 30% quota for women in all positions in government and in the parliament. So I think there's potential there for them to capitalize on this. But Yemen is a deeply, deeply conservative country, and so I think it will take time as this sort of cultural evolution happens, but there's a lot of potential in Yemen, and there are a number of women who are taking more prominent leadership roles within civil society movements, not so much in formal political structures, but they are asserting themselves. I would also note that one of the sort of primary women activists of the Yemeni movement won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, I think, Tawakkul Karman. So that brought a lot of sort of positive attention for women in their role.
Mm-hmm. Sir, I promise you the question.
Well, thank you for your clear analysis. I'm sure you chose your words carefully. You mentioned dignity as opposed to justice. I'd like to hear your explanation of the difference and why you thought dignity more than justice. And the second question, to what extent do you think this grand theft of the country's resources by these dictators had an impact on the uprising?
So the question is whether you chose dignity as opposed to justice in a deliberate fashion, and the second question is about the impact of corruption during the authoritarian regimes and how that might affect the new governments.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you asked that question actually about the theft of sort of state resources. On the first question, I did mention also justice and social justice. I mean, I think the difference, I think in a sense they're complementary. I think it's really about both. The dignity piece thing, I think, gets to this element of how people felt humiliated. And so then seeking justice, of course, is the recourse to that, so that I think they're linked. But to hear people talk, and this gets actually to the issue of corruption, to hear people talk about the humiliation that they felt at the hands of their government, whether it's at the hands of police who detain them for actually no reason, whether it's what happens in police stations and the sort of torture that would take place, the sort of these horrifying stories of public and private humiliation that really sort of seeped into the psyche of people, I think is an important aspect. On social justice, I would also link it, I guess, a bit to this question of inequality, and I think that's where the capture of state resources and this accumulation of wealth on the part of the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia, Mubarak and his family in Egypt, Saleh and his family in Yemen, Gaddafi, it's amazing when he was able to sort of steal out of the state coffers. In all of these cases, part of what was so distressing for people was to see how the narrow group around the president the family members, the sort of tight-knit network of associates was benefiting at the same time when the rest of the population was seeing declining standards of living and increasing prices and an inability to sort of cope with day-to-day life. So it's that disparity and that growing income inequality, I think, that also really prompted this sense of anger and frustration and feeling humiliated that how are they getting away with this? How are they able to benefit in this way? And we're really suffering. And I think, as these countries try and chart a path towards transitional justice, part of that is reclaiming those resources and reversing what these family members were able to get away with. They've been not terribly successful in those efforts, but it is underway, and they have been able to actually return some of the stolen assets.
Mm-hmm. Yep, sir, yes.
I have a question about what was the Gulf countries' attitude toward the political and social changes in these four countries. In other words, did they play a role to support or to lead the first maybe democratic experience in that region?
Whose response? I didn't quite.
The Gulf countries.
the Gulf
So the
countries,
question
okay.
was, how
Yeah.
did the Gulf countries respond to these transitions? Which is an excellent question, actually, and it really depends on which Gulf countries, because the position of Qatar, for instance, is completely different from the response of the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. And there's really two dimensions of this. One is that I think all of them are not keen to see democratic change and greater pluralistic systems in any of the transitioning countries. And so there is certainly a great deal of trepidation and fear and an inclination to sort of tamp down this process. But on a much more specific level, once they were underway, Qatar was a very active supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and financed the movement and gave significant funds to the government once the Muslim Brotherhood was in fact in power. This put them completely at odds with the rest of the Gulf countries, who see the Muslim Brotherhood as an inherent threat to their own countries. They all have sort of cells of Muslim Brotherhood activists that could potentially pose the greatest danger to their own system of control. And when the military coup happened over the summer, Qatar pulled its money out and ceased its funding for the then transitional government in Egypt. And Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE quickly stepped in to fill that gap and have actually doubled or tripled the amount of money that they're pouring in when compared with what Qatar was doing. So on one hand, they have been very reticent, very worried, and very much at odds with the United States and Europe about these transitions and what that portends for their own hold on power. And at the other end of the spectrum, they have engaged in a very active way in Egypt, to a lesser extent in Tunisia and Libya, but have also financed a great deal of assistance, and that kind of financing doesn't come without strings, so there's a clear expectation there. I think what's happening in Egypt right now is extremely dangerous, the game that the Gulf countries are playing, and as of now, I think they've poured in about $12 to $15 billion worth of assistance. I just heard a report yesterday that the UAE is going to finance a $40 billion initiative in Egypt. But what happens when that money stops flowing, and how is the economy going to function and transition to an actually productive economy that can create jobs? This money is not going to be a long-term solution for Egypt. And it essentially comes with the bargain of suppress and destroy the Muslim Brotherhood, and we'll continue financing you.
If I can expand on that, because it's such an interesting question, how for instance, the coup in Egypt divided the region, right? So you have Saudi Arabia, who was a strong supporter of the coup, and then Turkey, who had a much more critical stance, if I'm correct. So, and that allowed me to ask the question about Turkey, the role of Turkey in this process. I mean, what is your assessment of how the government has conducted its regional policy regarding the political changes?
I think initially Turkey was very engaged and very active, and there was a sense of synergy between an Islamist-led, potentially a moderate Islamist-led government in Tunisia and Egypt along the lines of a Turkey model. But unfortunately, I think Turkey has become consumed with its own domestic dilemma, and coupled with what's happening in Syria, to be quite honest, I don't think that they've had the bandwidth or the wherewithal to sort of play much of a role, or as much of a role, in Egypt or Tunisia. And again, with the change in government and deposing Mohamed Morsi, relations between Egypt and Turkey have essentially completely fallen apart. So it's really created huge divisions, both within the Gulf, between Turkey and Egypt. I mean, it's very divisive.
Okay. Yeah, yes, there. Yes, Joe. So the question is whether maybe it is wiser for the U.S. to stay back from what is happening there, given the history of U.S. involvement in the region.
Well, I think that the first question that we should always ask ourselves as Americans is sort of do no harm, which is, if what we're going to do is going to actually exacerbate the situation, then I agree we should essentially stand down. And I would note that these uprisings, these movements, really had nothing to do with the United States. They weren't anti-American, they weren't calling for American involvement, they really weren't about our engagement at all. They really were charting their own political course and determining their own future, and still are. I think the question is, when there is demand-led request for assistance, that's where we should evaluate whether or not we can have a positive role. If there's no one on the other end asking for our help, then I agree. There really isn't a large role that we should be playing. The reality is, though, that there are, particularly in terms of economic assistance. I mean, I think this is one area where we could and should still play more of an active role in trying to foster trade and investment. Not necessarily between the United States and these countries, but between these countries in Europe, between these countries among themselves. The Middle East and North Africa has the lowest level of intra-regional trade of any region in the entire world. So I think there's a lot more that we could be doing in terms of trying to help them generate productive economies that will benefit their population by creating new jobs and stimulating growth, without necessarily sort of direct political engagement that might potentially have negative consequences. The other thing I would note, though, is that I do think that there is a certain sense of responsibility, or a certain degree of concern that we should have when basic human rights are being trampled. And this is an extremely delicate and complicated question, and it's one that I think I know people in the White House, at the State Department, and in the European Union and in European member states are spending a lot of time thinking about, which is what to do in a place like Egypt right now, where there are some pretty basic rights that are really being overtaken by a singular focus on security. And I do think it's important to weigh in those moments when journalists are being arrested for no cause, when human rights activists are being imprisoned for tweeting something critical. So I do think that there is a role for us to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stuart?
Yeah, I've got a question about the issue of, if we were to give aid, could they use it effectively? Obviously, the first thing they need is a bureaucracy able to carry out whatever plan they might have, whatever policy they might try to implement. I mean, the sense that I get is that there's two categories. There's countries like Yemen and Libya that basically don't have a government bureaucracy capable of doing anything. And then Tunisia and Egypt, which have government bureaucracies,
So the question is, even if somebody there asks, should we, because we'll be able to use it in an effective manner?
This question of absorbative capacity is a really important question, and I think that that has been a central challenge in a lot of these cases. Part of it, I think, is identifying which institutions are functioning well and where they can absorb additional assistance. And there are. I mean, even in a place like Yemen that has a weak infrastructure and weak central government, you have things like the Social Fund for Development and other agencies that can absorb more assistance. The other is to utilize civil society organizations and other international institutions that may have operations on the ground as opposed to resorting only to government institutions. There has to be a balance between trying to build up the government institutions and yet at the same time you want to sort of deliver assistance. And in the case of a place like Tunisia, and even in Libya you hear this a lot, part of it is about coordinating better amongst ourselves so that, I've heard Libyans complain in certain, government officials will say, well, we have 1 million delegations of foreigners coming in all the time. We're spending all of our time greeting the French and then the Brits and then the Italians and the Americans, and we don't have time to do our work. So part of it, too, is about coordinating better amongst ourselves so that what we're trying to deliver can actually be digested by sort of these recipient agencies. So I think it's a combination. It's an excellent question and a concern, and finding appropriate interlocutors and agencies to engage with is quite difficult. But I think we can be more creative about how we're doing it. And there has been a move, in part because of what's been happening in Egypt, but there has been a move, certainly on the part of the European Union, to work more directly with civil society organizations on the ground rather than going through government institutions that either might be corrupt, consumed with other issues, or where we don't want to be supporting the government directly.
Let me take a question from, yes, sir, you, yes.
If I understood this correctly, it's only in the last day or two, the Saudi government publicly labeled the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And in doing so, they identified several countries where the Muslim Brotherhood exists, some of which are those countries we talked about tonight. My question is, in your opinion, what's the basis for the Saudi government doing this? Is there a growing threat from the Muslim Brotherhood, or perhaps does this reflect a growing sense of insecurity after the Saudi government?
So the question is why the Saudi Arabian government declared the Islamic Brotherhood a terrorist organization.
I think it actually has probably a lot more to do with this inter-Gulf rivalry and their desire to sort of stick a thumb in the nose of the Qataris, because they also expelled or they recalled their ambassadors from Qatar. And so this battle that's underway between them has just absolutely exploded in the last week. And I think this designation of the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization is sort of part and parcel, because Qatar is actually housing a lot of the leadership that escaped from Egypt. And so Saudi Arabia has been pressuring the Qataris to kick them out, to depose of Qaradawi, who's one of their leading sheikhs, and to take a number of other steps, including cutting off support for brothers that are actually still inside Egypt. So I think it represents more of that struggle than maybe anything that's happening inside Saudi Arabia itself.
Dan?
That's something that we might see in the future, that these countries are perhaps
So the first question is whether there is a danger of national fragmentation as a result of these processes of political change, and the second relates to whether some of these Gulf countries that are more supportive of Egypt are acting as proxies of the United States.
Let me start with the second question, because I was actually going to pick up on that point in the previous answer. Part of what's happening between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and UAE is actually making the United States' job far more difficult, because one of the things that the U.S. has been trying to do is repair relations with each of these countries, which has really seen a lot of damage over the past couple of years. Most importantly, Saudi Arabia. From the time that Mubarak was deposed or fled or overthrown, depending on what word you want to use, the perception among the Saudis is, we threw Mubarak under the bus, that this had been our ally. We didn't stand by him. How do we know that you'll stand by us? So starting with that, to the lack of communication about negotiations with Iran that led to this current stage of negotiations, there's a huge degree of resentment and frustration among the Saudis for not having been included in that, and they see this as really a severe threat to their own security interests, and frankly, I don't think they trust the process that's underway. So in an effort to sort of repair these relationships, one of the reasons President Obama is actually headed to Saudi Arabia later this month, and this sort of recent snafu between the Gulf countries, I think, will make his job that much harder in trying to sort of forge some sense of unity around these issues among the Gulf countries. So to the degree that there's coordination as they make these decisions, I'm not so certain that there is. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this recent move by Saudi Arabia caught the Obama administration by surprise. I think there's some elbowing going on right now, and quite frankly, I think Saudi is much more concerned with taking care of its own interests first and foremost, and it really sees the Brotherhood as an existential threat, and they're willing to sustain anger and distress from the United States in doing so.
What about the question of national fragmentation?
Right, on fragmentation, I think this really is such a clear indication that Sykes-Picot was a terrible idea, that what emerged, after World War I was really ill-conceived, and we're now seeing sort of the deterioration of that. At the same time, I don't see these countries breaking apart, with the exception potentially of Syria. But I think Sinai will remain part of Egypt, the south of Yemen will remain part of Yemen. Libya may end up being a federal state of 3 regions, but it will still be a unified state. I just think that though there's a lot of pressures and each of these individual regions has its own claims for autonomy and it's pushing for it, I think the countervailing pressure to retain a unitary state system from the rest of the international community will probably outweigh those developments.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Yes.
We in the United States look at the world through our eyes, so we see democracy as the only way. Historically, culturally, religiously, economically, we enter into areas and we don't have a full understanding of these areas. So we go in with our view, and a lot of times, for example, democracy doesn't start to grow. The seed doesn't take. Do you see any government in that region or in the world that might not be truly democratic, but have allowed the people to slowly progress toward democracy will eventually emerge?
So the question is whether there is a possibility of a slow, gradual process of democratic change.
Yeah, you might have an autocratic government.
Yeah.
You might have someone like Jordan, but yet the people can speak freely, or at least it appears that they can.
Mm-hmm.
Those type of things, and then the people can slowly develop to where democracy will have a lot of followers, a lot of chance to succeed, instead of being just thrusted on people.
Mm-hmm.
I use maybe Iraq as the example, where we went in there and didn't know that the Sunnis and the Shiites literally hated each other, and then they go to war, and they're fighting us, we're fighting them, and we're fighting everybody. So do you see a form of government that might be transitional between the dictator and the democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Working now?
Certainly Jordan and Morocco would like to put themselves in that category and would sort of portray themselves that way. I think the proof is in the pudding over time about whether or not they actually evolve to a point where monarchies are actually devolving real power. As far as I'm concerned, most of the changes that have been made in both countries have been cosmetic. And I question whether or not there's, I know for a fact that there is still a lot of suppression of public dissent and freedom of expression in both places. It's not to say that it couldn't happen. I'm just not convinced that it has been happening yet. But I would say on the flip side, in terms of, what happened in Iraq was by no means a popular uprising calling for political change. I think to compare what happened in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen with this, imposed solution from outside is sort of apples and oranges. I agree that democracy can't be can't be imposed from outside. It's not a system that you can import. And it was also very deliberate in my remarks, not necessarily to talk about democracy, but about building democratic institutions. And I do think that what people are calling for is responsive, inclusive government with peaceful transfer of power and accountable systems that are transparent. I don't think that's a Western concept that we're imposing. I think that's what people see around them as being more effective, as delivering better results. If they don't, then they're not going to demand it. And if they don't demand it, then it's never going to take hold. These have to be locally driven efforts, otherwise they're certain to fail. I think what happened in Iraq was a massive failure, and I certainly wouldn't wish that on any country. But I do think that what's underway is not really about American-style democracy. It's not really about what anyone wants for them from the outside. It's really more about creating, again, responsive government that actually delivers for its people. If that's through sort of electoral democracy as we define it, great. If it's through another type of system, great. I don't have sort of a prescribed notion of what that should look like, but I do think that there are real, genuine indigenous demands for political change, and that many people in Morocco and Jordan have been frustrated by the slow pace of change. I think they've been very good at sort of talking the talk and playing the game of international financial institutions and making economic reform changes that are probably good for the country, but not necessarily accompanying that with a real devolution of power from the palace to representative bodies. When that happens, then I think we'll be seeing quite a shift.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one question, maybe two if they are short, because she has to catch a plane.
He's had his hand up the entire time.
Yes.
The role of sectarian religious tensions in certain places, whether it's the Christians in Egypt, whether it's Jewish minorities in different places, and especially how it's in Syria, it seems to have been broken down, not entirely, but largely along sectarian lines. I think because the leader was a member of a minority. It's very hard in a lot of these places for the leader, like the Bard, to just lead without putting up with the real fight.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could just
So what is the role of religious sectarian violence or disputes?
I was hoping to avoid that topic, so we shouldn't have called on you.
I should have stopped it 5 minutes ago.
I'm teasing. It's just very complicated. No, I actually had a point in my notes, and I accidentally skipped over it. I think this issue of sectarian deterioration or deterioration along sectarian lines is really worrisome, and it's present in almost every single one of these countries. And I think what's most distressing about it is that a lot of this has been exacerbated by the role that Iran and Saudi Arabia have been playing in these countries. Many of these places didn't have these sectarian tensions 3, 4, 5 years ago. A perfect example is in Yemen, where the Houthi rebel group in the north has been pressing for autonomy for 4, 5, 6 years and has fought several wars with the central government prior to the wave of uprisings. They belong to what's often termed as being a Shia sect, but that branch of Shiism is actually much closer to sort of mainstream dominant Sunni Islam than it is to the Iranian form of Shiism. But when there was an opportunity to sort of manipulate and kind of sow greater unrest in Yemen, Iran took that opportunity because this is a battlefield with Saudi Arabia. So you have Saudis supporting one side, you have the Iranians supporting and funding another side. The country is heavily armed, and the fighting has continued. Meanwhile, the conflict has absolutely nothing to do with religious ideology whatsoever. This is about wanting local autonomy, greater government resources investing in their region, and an ability to govern themselves. It has nothing to do with religion. Same thing in Syria. The Alawis were though Bashar al-Assad and his regime had always sort of used very repressive tactics in terms of keeping the country together, there was not necessarily a tension along religious lines between the Alawis, the Sunnis, and Christian minorities. I'm not going to say that they lived peacefully and everything was wonderful, but this was not necessarily a central point of division until things started to fracture and until in large part, Iran's support for Hezbollah to fight on the side of the Alawis made this a Shia-Sunni issue. This was not in existence beforehand. So I think the sectarian tensions are now a real and present danger, but in some cases are either fabricated or exacerbated by the manipulation of Iran and Saudi Arabia in these various conflicts. And how you put the genie back in the bottle, I have no idea.
Okay, so now, yes, sir, the last one.
Although Al Jazeera America and in Europe, Al Jazeera English, has a reputation of being fair, balanced, and nonpartisan, I wonder if in the Middle East, Al Jazeera Arabic is still different. And with your reporters being now in jail in Egypt, is this, to what extent is this because of lack of freedom of the press? What extent is the Hariri politics forcing those reporters?
So the question is relating to the perception of the public in the Middle East of Al Jazeera, or how governments deal with Al Jazeera?
I think I understood the question.
Yeah, okay.
I think for the past couple of years, I mean, since the uprising started in Egypt, and Al Jazeera covered that very closely and very heavily in a lens that was seen as very favorable to the Muslim Brotherhood. Since that time, and probably even predating it, most in the Arab world have really seen Al Jazeera as being very sort of partisan and sympathetic to the Brotherhood. And so that colors, I think, their neutrality. Lots of people still watch it and choose to to follow their coverage. But I think knowing that that's kind of the lens that they are taking, the fact that these journalists have been arrested is clearly an effort to sort of clamp down on any sort of pro-Muslim Brotherhood sentiment or coverage. And it's meant to be a chilling effect from the Egyptian military-led government to Qatar, back out, keep your resources out of here, as well as to the rest of the world. And I think what they're going through right now has been quite terrifying, not only for them, but for all journalists who are in Egypt trying to cover what's actually happening. I just had a colleague who's not a journalist, but is a researcher. And because of this climate of fear now, she deliberately didn't set up any meetings with anyone affiliated in any way with the Brotherhood for fear of being arrested. And it's a real and present fear.
Mm-hmm. Before we give Danya a warm applause, for those of you who are interested in Egypt or want to continue this conversation, I have a public announcement to make. The Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures is having its Distinguished Scholar Series. So tomorrow at 5:15 in Bayer Sharp Hall, Elias Khoury, a native of Beirut, is going to be talking about the Arab intellectuals and the revolution, a missed opportunity. So you can find details in the website. I just wanted to alert you to this talk about the Middle East that is happening tomorrow. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Great.